You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into episode 507 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast. As y'all will recall, we talked about logistics in the last episode and highlighted the importance of the Western and Atlantic Railroad in that regard, both in terms of supply and also in connection with strategy.
With this show, we'll talk about the two armies in a bit more detail. The 100,000-man force that William Tecumseh Sherman labored so hard and so successfully to feed and supply lay in winter camps scattered across the region from the Tennessee state capital of Nashville, south to Chattanooga, and over to northern Alabama and into northwestern Georgia, and eastward from Nashville to Knoxville.
Those men in three armies, acting more or less independently, were the forces that had overrun so much of the Confederate heartland in the war's first 3 years. In the winter of 1863-64, they were united under one command and stood poised to continue their work of conquest in the coming spring.
In modern military jargon, Sherman's command would be called an Army Group. George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland was the largest component of Sherman's military division of the Mississippi. In 1861, 62, and 63, the Army of the Cumberland, sometimes under other names, had maneuvered and fought its way southward along the Louisville, Nashville, Chattanooga corridor.
The winter of 1863-64 found it concentrated in the Chattanooga area. When the campaign opened in May 1864, the Army of the Cumberland consisted of 3 infantry corps, the 4th, 14th, and 20th, and a cavalry corps.
Major General Oliver Otis Howard commanded 4th Corps. Major General John Palmer led 14th Corps, and Major General Joseph Hooker commanded 20th Corps. Then Brigadier General Washington Elliott commanded the Cavalry Corps. Each of those corps was composed of 3 divisions.
Fighting Joe Hooker was the odd man out in the Army of the Cumberland. As a former commander of the Army of the Potomac, in the fall of 1863, he had come west leading the reinforcements the Federals rushed from Virginia to Tennessee. Hooker regarded himself as a better general than George Thomas or Sherman, and he and Sherman did not get along at all.
On April 30th, the Army of the Cumberland numbered some 72,900 officers and men. Each of its 3 infantry corps had a strength of about 21,000, the cavalry corps about 9,000. The Army's artillery numbered 130 guns, organized with 2 or 3 batteries, each of 4 to 6 guns, assigned to each division.
The Army of the Tennessee, which under Grant's and then Sherman's command, had spent 1861, 62, and most of 1863 reestablishing federal control of the Tennessee and Mississippi rivers. When Sherman succeeded Grant as commander of the military division of the Mississippi, his favorite subordinate, Major General James McPherson, was given command of the Army of the Tennessee.
Like Thomas's force, McPherson's army also consisted of 3 infantry corps, the 15th, 16th, and 17th. Major General John Logan commanded 15th Corps, which was organized into 3 divisions for field service with Sherman.
16th Corps had been split up. 2 of its divisions had remained out in Mississippi River Valley, and the other 2 shifted to Tennessee.
The latter 2, designated the Left Wing 16th Corps, were commanded by Brigadier General Grenville Dodge. Several thousand troops from 17th Corps had also remained in the Mississippi Valley. Major General Francis Blair commanded the 2 divisions of that corps slated to operate with Sherman. However, in late April, Blair and his 2 divisions had not yet reached the front. They were still in Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, where they'd gone under the veteran furlough policy.
The remainder of McPherson's field army was strung out along the railroad south of Nashville to Decatur, Alabama, and thence eastward to Chattanooga.
At the end of April, the 2 corps with McPherson numbered 24,380 officers and men. The Army of the Tennessee had 96 pieces of artillery, with 2 or 3 batteries attached to each of its 5 infantry divisions. Except for a few acting as escorts, guides, scouts, and couriers, the Army included no mounted troops.
The third element in Sherman's army group, the Army of the Ohio, was based at Knoxville, which it had captured in the late summer of 1863 by moving southeast from Kentucky.
At one time, it had been larger, but by the end of April 1864, the Army of the Ohio was an army in name only, consisting of just 12,800 officers and men. Major General John Schofield commanded both the Army and its principal component, 23rd Corps, which was organized into 3 infantry divisions. Schofield's command also included a division of cavalry, and 23 field pieces accompanied the Army of the Ohio.
The structure of Sherman's force was the end product of several weeks of reorganization during which the federal commander sought to shape his formations for the upcoming spring campaign.
However, the resulting organization had 2 glaring weaknesses. The most serious difficulty stemmed from the difference in the sizes of the 3 armies. During the Atlanta campaign, this great disparity of strength would sometimes cause problems. The Army of the Cumberland proved too large for rapid movement, and the other 2 armies often proved too weak to accomplish their missions.
Schofield, who at the time didn't question the arrangement, nevertheless wrote after the war that Sherman hadn't adopted the obvious remedy of transferring troops from the Army of the Cumberland to the smaller armies because George Thomas didn't want to give up any of his men, and the men didn't want to serve in another army.
However, 20th Corps hadn't come west until the fall of 1863 and hadn't been a part of the Army of the Cumberland for very long. In addition, the current iteration of the Corps was a new organization created during the winter by merging several units. And so, some of its troops could have been shifted to McPherson and Schofield to bolster their numbers. But there was another problem, though, with 20th Corps and its commander.
To remedy difficulties caused by the size of the armies, Sherman often detached elements of the Army of the Cumberland and sent them to, quote-unquote, cooperate with or support or operate with McPherson or Schofield. And on several occasions, this ad hoc arrangement only created more problems.
That's because Hooker was an able, vain, and pompous officer who believed that he deserved a far higher position than he held, did outrank McPherson and Schofield, and resented being sent to serve with, or worse yet, under them. Then 14th Corps Commander John Palmer was junior to McPherson, but believed he outranked Schofield, and he proved just as averse to serving under a lower-ranking officer as did Hooker.
In some instances, not surprisingly, Hooker or Palmer refused to obey orders from Schofield or McPherson, or fell into arguments with them over whose troops should take precedence in a marching column or at a river crossing. Such petty squabbling not only wasted time, but sometimes cost the lives of good soldiers who were sacrificed to a general's stubborn pride.
Interestingly, that fall, after the difficulties caused by Hooker and Palmer had hampered Sherman's operations during the Atlanta campaign and led to their departure, the War Department ruled that assignment of a general to command an army or a corps gave him temporary superiority of rank over officers of the same grade who held command at lower levels.
In any case, the second problem with Sherman's organization stemmed from the cavalry. The Army Group contained 4 divisions of horsemen, 3 with Thomas, 1 with Schofield, totaling about 12,000 troopers, and Sherman elected to take personal control of them.
Sherman did not, however, create a single cavalry force to operate under his direct command. Instead, he dealt with the divisions separately. In the early part of the campaign, Sherman usually deployed 1 mounted division to guard each flank of the Army Group, 1 to protect his line of supply in the area immediately behind the front, and held 1 as a reserve. In using his cavalry in this unimaginative way, Sherman deprived himself of a large, fast-moving strike force that, at several times during the campaign, might have inflicted great damage on the Confederates.
In limiting his cavalry to a defensive role, Sherman's decision may have been influenced by the absence of a dynamic, trustworthy officer to place in command of the Army Group's horsemen.
Or by a simple failure on Sherman's part to appreciate the potential of a large and aggressive mounted force.
But whatever the reason for its organization and employment, the result was that the Union cavalry was virtually invisible during the first half of the campaign and ineffective in the last part.
Well, hindsight being 2020, the flaws in the organization of Sherman's Army Group can best be seen in retrospect, because at the time, the flaws and the problems to which they were to lead weren't so obvious. Working in the Federals' favor was the fact that a military force doesn't need to have a perfect organization to be successful. It only needs to be good enough to defeat the enemy. And so the Atlanta campaign would be the test of whether Sherman's awkward, unbalanced force was good enough to defeat the Confederates' Army of Tennessee.
This is a real good story about Bronx and his dad, Ryan, real United Airlines customers.
We were returning home, and one of the flight attendants asked Bronx if he wanted to see the flight deck and meet Captain Andrew.
I got to sit in the driver's seat.
I grew up in an aviation family, and seeing Bronx kind of reminded me of myself when I was that age.
That's Andrew, a real United pilot.
These small interactions can shape a kid's future.
It felt like I was the captain.
Allowing my son to see the flight deck will stick with us forever.
That's how good leads the way.
If you still think Paul Revere took a midnight ride and said the British are coming, have I got some news for you. Well, maybe not breaking news because it happened in 1775, but apparently still news to you. Founded as a historical podcast where we find out how the American Revolution wasn't just all taxes and tea parties. We're diving deep into the Founding Fathers' diaries and finding all the drama because the tea was hot before and after they dumped it into the harbor, and the people who were there were far more than the glossary terms you might have come across in a textbook. But you may want to take notes because there might be a pop quiz. So tune into Founded, where you could find out how John Hancock was more than his signature and how Samuel Adams had nothing to do with the beer. You can also find out how future president and father of the United States of America, George Washington, accidentally confessed to murder. So come find all the stories you didn't know you wanted to know with me, Tori Phantom, on Founded, part of the Airwave Media Network and available everywhere you find your favorite podcasts with new episodes every Friday.
Across the lines, Sherman's counterpart, Joseph E. Johnston, also labored over problems of organization that winter, some of which we've already touched upon.
We mentioned how Johnston found the Army of Tennessee divided into 2 infantry corps and a cavalry corps. He believed that the army would be more flexible and easier to handle if the infantry were organized into 3 corps. But when he requested permission to make this change, the War Department in Richmond shot down the idea, and the episode only served to widen the rift between Johnston and Confederate President Jefferson Davis.
We also talked about the addition of John Bell Hood to the Army of Tennessee as a corps commander. Hood, after arriving at Dalton, Georgia, displaced Thomas Hindman, who reverted to command of his division. Johnston welcomed Hood, who was widely and correctly regarded as a fighting general. Meanwhile, Hindman, who wasn't happy about losing his chance for permanent corps command, submitted his resignation, but Jefferson Davis refused to accept it.
We've tried to stress that during the winter, Joe Johnston accomplished a great deal. He dramatically transformed the Army of Tennessee by bringing about improvements in its supply situation. That success, in turn, helped rebuild morale. So too did a system of furloughs he implemented. His reorganization of several parts of the Army, restoring the division structure that had existed before late 1863, also helped boost the troops' spirits.
Under Johnston's early 1864 reorganization, several brigades were returned to divisions to which they had earlier belonged. They therefore found themselves reunited with commanders and comrades whom they knew and trusted.
A regular program of drill, along with frequent inspections and other ceremonies, and even mock battles, improved the overall attitude of the Army. By late April, new recruits and veterans returning from the hospitals had boosted the Army's strength to 55,000 officers and men. In many ways, by May 1864, the Army of Tennessee was a much better force than it had been at the end of 1863, and Joe Johnston deserves the lion's share of the credit for that transformation.
Johnston had done a fine job with the Army's rank and file, but the same couldn't be said for the relations among his commanders and their personal and professional relationship with him. That's because many of the old, toxic command problems that bedeviled the Army lingered on into 1864.
Johnston's presence in Dalton merely gave those problems a new, more complex form, and the arrival of Hood in late February added yet another layer of complexity to the mess.
Since at least mid-1862, the Army of Tennessee had been severely handicapped by a bitter split between 2 groups of its high-ranking officers. Subordinate generals in the Army who opposed Braxton Bragg had worked ceaselessly to undermine his authority and bring about his removal from command.
They clashed with a smaller group of Loyalist officers who had sought to sustain the embattled Bragg. This rupture had poisoned the Army's command structure and affected its performance. Much of the long-standing bitterness between the 2 factions lingered on after Bragg left the Army late in 1863, after the debacle at Missionary Ridge outside Chattanooga.
When Jefferson Davis summoned Bragg to Richmond to be his chief military advisor, that new assignment put Bragg in position to continue meddling in the internal affairs of the Army of Tennessee, and over the next 8 months he often did so.
Another development loomed even more ominously over the rebels. That's because with Johnston at the head of the Army at Dalton and Bragg at the president's side in Richmond, the intramural squabbles in the Army of Tennessee became tied into Confederate politics. Johnston and Davis's feud and Bragg's history with the Army now connected in such a way that friends of Bragg became also supporters of the president and therefore enemies of Johnston. Johnston's political allies were critics of Davis and now of Bragg's also. Bragg's old enemies in the Army itself, however, didn't necessarily become supporters of Johnston. These confusing developments led during the winter to an odd situation.
Several of Johnston's subordinates who were Bragg loyalists in their back-channel correspondence with their old chief went out of their way to contradict Johnston's official statements to the War Department about the Army's condition and its offensive capabilities.
That correspondence strengthened the impression in Richmond that only Johnston's unwillingness to mount an offensive stood in the way of the rebels launching a strike to regain Tennessee. Those back-channel letters greatly decreased the already slight probability that there would be any significant level of cooperation or agreement between Johnston at Dalton and the Davis administration in Richmond.
The messy situation between Johnston and Davis and Bragg also led to a strained relationship within the Army of Tennessee between Joe Johnston on one hand and each of his principal lieutenants on the other.
Johnston and William Hardee had had several disputes in the fall of 1863 when they served together in Mississippi. Then Johnston's gloomy early 1864 picture of the Army of Tennessee's condition contrasted sharply with the optimistic reports Hardee had sent to Richmond during the period he was temporarily in command after Bragg's departure.
In the early months of 1864, Johnston usually didn't consult with Hardee about any matters of importance, which irked Hardee, who viewed it as a deliberate slight. And so Hardee, although a bitter enemy of Bragg, didn't gravitate into the pro-Johnston camp.
Hood, an outsider from Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia, had no previous connection with either of the pre-existing factions in the Army of Tennessee, although he owed his promotion to corps command in part to Bragg, who had advocated for it in the fall of 1863 while he was in command of the army.
For his part, Joe Johnston looked to Hood as the general most likely to help the army. Even as he ignored Hardee, Johnston turned to his new corps commander as the subordinate upon whom he could most rely.
Unknown to Joe Johnston, though, John Bell Hood carried on an unofficial correspondence with some of his contacts in Richmond, including Jefferson Davis, and his letters often contained criticisms of Johnston and were filled with not-so-subtle hints that the Army of Tennessee would be able to take the fight to the enemy if only it had a commander who was willing to make the effort.
So Hardee was unhappy, Hood had visions of Army command dancing in his head, and Cavalry Chief Joseph Wheeler, the Army's 3rd Corps commander, had long been a member of the pro-Bragg faction, and in fact owed his position to Bragg's patronage. In the first half of 1864, he too sent several letters to Richmond that were highly critical of Johnston's management of the Army.
Historian Stephen Woodworth described the high command of the Army of Tennessee as, quote, a pit of vipers, end quote. That Joe Johnston inherited a mess when he reached Dalton could be directly attributed to Jefferson Davis's refusal to deal with the problem earlier, even though he had had several opportunities to do so. The situation in the Army's high command didn't get any better that winter and spring, although the trouble didn't take the form of the open revolts that had flared up under Bragg.
The conflicts under Johnston were more subtle, but they were there, and they helped poison relations and increase the distrust between Johnston's headquarters in Georgia and the Davis administration in Richmond. They also hampered cooperation between the Army's generals.
Quarrels, such as those that did so much to handicap the Army of Tennessee, aren't unusual in large organizations, but rarely do they have such dire consequences for an entire nation. The circumstances that made the dysfunction in the Army of Tennessee so disastrous for the rebels stemmed directly from the personalities of Jefferson Davis, Braxton Bragg, and Joe Johnston, and in particular, Davis's desire to micromanage Confederate military affairs, yet evade dealing with the long-standing problems that plagued the Army of Tennessee's high command. On the federal side, by contrast, the trust between Grant and Sherman and that developing between Lincoln and Grant meant that such weak leadership and dysfunction would have no real impact. If, for example, Hooker wanted to criticize Sherman, and he did, he wouldn't find anyone in real authority in the Lincoln administration who would pay attention to his whining letters. Joe Johnston's critics, on the other hand, knew they'd always find Jefferson Davis and Braxton Bragg to be receptive to criticism about Johnston and the way he was running the Army of Tennessee.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Conquered, Why the Army of Tennessee Failed by Larry J. Daniel.
In case you can't tell, we're kind of fascinated by the story of the Confederates' Army of Tennessee. So that, plus the fact any book by Larry J. Daniel is worth a read, brings us to recommend Conquered, Why the Army of Tennessee Failed, which I would have swore just came out in the last year or two, but actually came out in 2019. So I guess the last 5 years or so have been a bit of a blur.
As always, you can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you pull up the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find detailed information on the shows and movies Tracy and I streamed last week. Yeah, just kidding. You won't find that, but you will find info about how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and support the podcast in that way, just like the one and only Brian S. did this past week. Oh, seriously, Brian, you were literally the one and only person to join the Strawfoot Brigade this past week. So, without you, we'd be high and dry here with this segment. So a big, big thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
A big thank you also to Spiritwood Music for permission to use their song Midnight on the Water as the music you hear at the start and at the end of every episode. And then last, but not least, thanks to each of you for listening to this show. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.